Hello, I'm James Gad, professor of psychology, and I want to walk you through how to present yourself professionally in academic writing. This presentation is primarily for students, designed for students. Others may find some helpful things in it as well. And in this, I want to talk about, first of all, how we present ourselves professionally and appropriately in an academic setting in certain communications. But then I want to get primarily into how we do that in our APA formatted papers. How do we present ourselves professionally and correctly and academically, if you will, in the work that we turn in for our classes? So that's what the primary focus of this presentation is about. But I want to start with an email that I actually received from a student. And notice how this is worded as you just see it here. No capitalization, no punctuation, and notice the content of it. Now, what I want you to do is to think about, if you're the professor and you receive this email, what are you going to do with it? How can you help the student with her needs? I don't understand the assignment. I listened in class, but ... So don't think I didn't. Okay, who are you? What class you're referring to? What assignment are you referring to? And what do you need help with? What are you not understanding? I didn't accuse you of not listening in class. Maybe you think you didn't and you're feeling guilty. I don't know. But whatever it is, I cannot help you with this problem that you have. Not only that, what does this say about the student? How does this look? You may be the smartest student in the entire class, but your email says otherwise. And that's what I want to kind of emphasize as you pay attention to how you present yourself. So here's maybe a better way to do that. So instead of that email, Dr. Guy, I am Jane Doe in your 7:30 Intro to Psych class. And that's a little casual, but that's okay in this case. Intro to Psych class, abbreviated. I am having trouble understanding the instructions for the article review assignment. I recall you went over these in class and I understand that part, but I have a question about the whatever other part. You'll specify what that part is. The instructions state so-and-so, so I'm telling you what I'm referring to, what part I'm asking about, but I'm unclear if that means this or if it means to do that. Would you mind clarifying that for me? Thank you for your help, and I'm learning a lot from your lectures. You throw a little bragging there. Then the instructor, as a professor, I can reply and say, well, I'm glad you're learning from the class. Sure, I'll be glad to help you in that particular assignment. What it means in those instructions is for you to do the former you mentioned, do this thing. So I can help that student. I can reply right then. I don't have to send the emails back and forth and say, thank you for email, but what class are you in, what assignment, and what help do you really need? Okay. So again, not only does it allow the email to get answered, the problem that you're having in the first place, here's your need, but what does that say about you? You notice the difference in how the first email is presented and how the second email is presented? What does that say of the student? Again, it may be the smartest, whatever student in the class, but the email doesn't say that. Here's another one, and this again is a real one edited slightly for confidentiality. And if you try to read this in one breath, you can't do it. Probably what happened is the student text their email to their phone or something like that, but this is how it comes across, okay? And there's a lot of different things you could notice in here that might send a certain message about a student, right or wrong. But just look at the grammar, look at the lack of punctuation, the address, those kind of things. So try to read it in one breath. Mr. James, I just got back from vacay and behind on work. Can you tell me what is due now? I finna do the exam, but can you get FA, financial aid, to release my money? Because I ain't got no money to buy my book because I was sick the first 2 weeks of class and on vacay last week, and I promise I'm running out of breath. I'm usually a good student, in my opinion, but I just had a bad time so far. What does this say about you as a student when the professor gets this? Well, it can say a lot of things, but it's difficult to help that student. It's difficult to even read that particular email. So how do you fix it? Well, just start over, because it had a lot of things that needs to be corrected in that. But you see how that works. The point is, I want you to see how what you send in communication, how it's received on the other end. Now, there's always misunderstandings or difficult to interpret things in emails and written text, those kind of things, because we don't see the facial expressions and the nonverbal communications. And we do have to pay attention to that too. But this is an extreme case. These are the type of emails that we often actually get from students. Don't be that student. Present yourself in a professional way, which not only, again, says something about you and your reputation and that kind of thing to the professors, but it also allows the professors to actually handle whatever it is that you need. Okay, so here's just some guidelines or suggestions you might find helpful. First of all, address the recipient by their correct name and title. So if they are a doctor, don't call them Mr. or Mrs. or by their first name or those kind of things. Again, there are different philosophies and beliefs about that, but there's reasons for it. Okay, that's the way to do that. Sometimes it takes work. You may have to look at the website where their bio is listed, or ask somebody, or ask them even sometimes. Never address a professor or somebody like that by their first name if you're a student, unless they insist. Sometimes I insist on you calling me Fred or whatever their name is. Sometimes this is particularly in doctorate level cases where they might call each other by their first name, the professor and the student. But in most cases, unless that's just a big issue for that professor, call them Dr. whatever it is. I remember in my doctorate degree, we had this professor, and some would call him by their first name, some would doctor, and I asked, which he preferred, and his reply was, I don't care which one you call me, just don't call me late for supper, age-old joke. But what I got from that is he didn't say, please call me by my first name or that kind of thing, which probably meant he would rather have being called by his title. So do that. That's always the best thing. And again, it's not an issue of pride. It's not that the person you're referring to in that way is better than you, but it's simply respect, and again, professional appearance. So again, it's how you're viewed. So again, highly recommend that you follow that protocol. And when in doubt, use the higher address. If you're not sure if they're doctor or not, call them doctor. They can correct you if you can't find out if that's their title or what title to use otherwise. And then use correct grammar and punctuation. Again, email and other communications maybe do allow for a little more casual language, as the example I gave earlier. Instead of saying PY whatever 101 introduction to psychology, that email just said intro to your 7:30 intro to psych class. So that's okay. The communication is good and it still looks professional enough. But remember, an email is not a text message. And even if you are text messaging, some professors give their cell phones, or they have maybe a work cell phone. Even if you're text messaging, they shouldn't look the same as many send the text message to their friends with abbreviations and casual stuff and that kind of thing. Again, your goal is to communicate to your professor something that you have need of, or something you need to take care of, or need them to answer, whatever it is. So emails like the one that the two that I showed you earlier, emails, communications that look like that, papers that look like that, send the message of one of two things. Either, again, they may not be true, but they send you a message based on what's in front of the professor. You're either incapable of doing college level work because you can't even write a complete sentence. You don't even know how to use punctuation and capitalization and whatever. Or you don't care enough to write correctly and are lazy, or both perhaps. Now, the truth is, neither of these may be true. You may be the smartest, student in the class, in the school, English grammar better than the English professors, but that's not what is communicated in your emails or the things that you sent. So again, how does it look on the other end? That's what you really want to pay attention to. So let's talk then a little bit about the APA formatting. I know a lot of students stress over this. In reality, APA formatting, I've used other formats as well, is my favorite. And a lot of times the only reason students struggle with it is because they fear it. They're anxious about it. And I've used MLA or whatever it is they've used my whole life, and now I got to change to another one. Well, that is a challenge. But I think once you get to use APA format and you're realizing it kind of makes sense. Now, The 7th edition is now the current edition. I've been through the 5th and the 6th edition. I'm old enough to do both of those. The 6th edition had some things in it that really didn't make sense. And, you know, every format has some things that we would say don't make sense. For one, the main one is on the title page, you used to have to put the word running head. And then on the rest of the pages where the running head appeared, you took off the word running head. That never made any sense to me. And it was difficult to format in Word and that kind of thing. And so I would do a template where I had to get all that to work for students because it was just too a challenge. That didn't make any sense to me. So you'll find things like that that don't make sense to you. However, there's reasons for using the format, a particular format. It does matter. The first thing, though, that you need to do is be sure that you have one of these. I have one of each of these. They're the same book. One is the paperback book on the left side, and then the spiral bound with the tabs on the right side. I thought I would like the spiral bound because it lays open on your desk well, and that is what I've been using mostly. But it's a little bit difficult to fumble through the tabs, actually. So you may find the paperback version better and break it in real good, make it lay out on your desk. But whichever one you prefer, get one or both of those. You got to have that. As a psychology student or any major where you use APA, get the manual. Don't rely on the internet or templates or even the OWL site. OWL site's pretty good, but you want to get a manual. All right. Use your manual. Oftentimes I'll get a paper and the APA formatting is not good, or the references are oftentimes not properly capitalized or italicized or whatever it is. And you can tell all you have to do is turn to chapter 10 in the 7th edition to the reference examples, and you can see exactly how to format your reference. But you just didn't use your manual. So use your manual. Format your title page correctly. This is the very first thing that your reader sees. If your title page doesn't look good, your professor already has an idea that maybe you didn't put a lot of effort into your paper, or paying attention to the format, or whatever it might be, or maybe you're incapable. Again, it may not be true, but it can say that to your professor or whoever's reading your paper. If you're submitting something for publication and they open it up and it's not an APA format, starting with a title page, they're likely not even to read it or even consider it for publication. They'll just round file it, file 13 we used to call it, or send it back to you and deny even looking at it. So you want to make sure, make that good first impression. Even when optional, this is different in the 7th edition from the 6th edition, where in student papers, running heads aren't necessarily required, but running heads are recommended. Even if they're optional, and they are in student papers, and your professor may say otherwise, or your university, I recommend them, and I'll tell you why. One, because they look more professional. It looks like an APA paper, for one. It looks more professionally laid out. It also keeps your paper topic before your reader. So every page, it's almost like seeing your title on every page. Not a big deal, but again, it does look professional. It does look a little more APA-like, if you will. Not that APA is God and MLA is not, but it does kind of help. So I recommend you using them. Some professors and some departments or colleges are going to require them anyway. And that's what, in fact, we're going to do, is require the running heads to be used. But maybe that's just because we're old school. I don't know. But I recommend using them. Your abstract is not an introduction. This is a mistake I see very, very commonly. You'll open the paper, title page may be written just perfect. Get to the abstract, and it's in this paper, such and such will be discussed, and this topic will be explored, and these 3 things are going to be looked at, or whatever it is. And it's written like an introduction. The abstract is not an introduction. It's a summary of your paper. When do you write your introduction? Usually when you start your paper. When do you write your abstract? After your paper is written. You summarize that paper in a short paragraph, less than 250 words, in your abstract. All right. And then another thing, very, very, very important. This is a big deal with me, pet peeve of mine, if you will. Use headings in your paper. If you write a 1-page paper about one topic, you know, that kind of thing, maybe you don't need the headings. But if you write anything of any length, even 2 or 3 pages paper, use headings. At least use 2 level 1 headings to kind of organize your work. And this is just absolutely is one main topic, period. But if you use any kind of subtopics, any kind of divisions, divide your paper up, because that it not only looks better, but it guides your reader in understanding what you're saying. Think about that. Why do you write a paper? For somebody else to read. Yeah, I know you write it for a grade or pass the class or whatever it is, but you're writing a paper for someone else to read. You're sharing information. Headings guide your reader in understanding what you're saying. It also, though, guides you in writing it, because you have now sort of a fill in the blank form, if you will, sort of a checklist that put those headings in or start with. That's how I recommend doing it. Go ahead and do your headings that you're going to talk about. You can change them, but you'll go through there and basically fill in the content under each of those headings. If you find something in a research article you're looking at that fits 2 headings down, then you can go ahead and stick that in there and come back to where you were writing, and you kind of organize everything. So it helps you writing as well. It also helps minimize reader fatigue, because if you have just a long paper, sometimes I'll get one that doesn't even have it'd be 5 pages and not a single paragraph break even. It's just a solid script. Well, you can't hardly read that. It's fatiguing. You don't know what's being said. You lose your concentration. So again, strongly recommend that you use headings unless it's just a really short paper. Use a quality and correct template. Or template, I usually say. There are a lot of them out there that you can use. There are a lot of them on the internet, but a lot of them are not correct. And so make sure that the one you're using is correct, that you get it from a reputable source, but make sure that if it comes from a professor that in the APA style psychology department, maybe it's probably correct. They've probably gone through it, but make sure that it is. You check it first, and then you can, once you get a good one that you like, you can use it from now on. Just save it on your computer. Anytime you have to write a paper, open up that, save it as in a new file, whatever your paper name is, and start writing your paper. So you want to do that, but make sure they're right. The ones that are oftentimes come in Word or those kind of things are not right. They might say APA, but they're very incorrect. So make sure good template that is correct, and it's for the 7th edition. In writing your papers, make sure that you use Microsoft Word. Most journals, for example, will sometimes accept a number of different formats. Maybe a doc or a PDF or a lot of other things. But for most of your academic papers you turn in, you want to turn it into Word, because that's sort of the standard, whether we like it or not. A lot of discussions lately about WordPerfect, how great that was. And I remember starting with that, and I did like it better, still do, but it's not the standard anymore, like it or not. But Microsoft Word is the standard document to use. Also, there are a lot of people like myself who use a grading software where we can actually mark errors and things like that right in the document. So you can open up your paper and see right where you made an error or did something good or whatever it is. And so you'll be able to see it right there with it. So there's a lot of different reasons for that. If you don't use Word, or if you don't have Word, because it does generally cost money unless it's provided by your institution, and that's usually on campus. There are some compatible things to use, mainly OpenOffice. There's a software program that has all the different Microsoft Suite compatibility programs in it. OpenOffice, that's a free download. I think it's made by the same people as Firefox browser, and you can download that, and it usually will come out correct. And usually, some students have had trouble with it, but usually students can see the comments where I graded it. So recommend that. Word 360, even though it's a Microsoft product, is terrible. Students have more trouble with it, I think, than anything else, and probably right next to it is Google Docs. Now, Google Docs does have an option, at least in some versions, where you can download a document as a Microsoft Word file. However, usually when that happens, the formatting is not correct. There's extra lines, the running head may not even be there, or a lot of different things like that. So again, I recommend using Microsoft Word or maybe OpenOffice or something that is compatible. And then be sure, and you'll hear me say this several times, be sure to cite all information, not just quotes. Everything that you get from somewhere is to be cited. Now, there's one exception, and that is something called common knowledge. Common knowledge just simply means that everybody pretty much knows about it and does not need to be cited. And I give an example a lot of times of Freud's id, ego, and the superego. So if I say Freud identified, or Freud just referred to Freud's id, ego, and superego, I don't really need to cite that. I didn't get that from somewhere else. Everybody in psychology at least knows about that. However, if I start talking about something in that I got from somewhere else, some article or somebody's opinion about how to use the id, ego, and superego, for example, that has to be cited. I'm getting information from somewhere else that I need to cite it. So again, always cite your information. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Write in academic or professional language with correct grammar, punctuation, capitalization, etc. You'll be surprised at how often I get papers that look very similar to the emails that I showed you all ago. Maybe not quite that bad, although sometimes the grammar is much worse. And so again, one is not good communication. The people reading that, the professor reading that, probably doesn't really even know what you're trying to say here. Plus, it looks very bad and unprofessional for you and likely will get you a bad grade. Now, content's one thing, grammar's another thing, but they do interchange. And so grammar does matter, even if it's not an English class. Do not write in the way you talk or text. That's what happens a lot of times. Students will write a paper using the same kind of language and grammar, and sometimes even text type abbreviations that they use when they're texting a friend, or the way that they talk. The way we talk to one another, or even the way I talk on this, is, you have certain buzzwords or slang or whatever it is that you use in conversation that's fine to use. However, in a paper, you want it to be academic, you want it to be proper grammar and good English, that kind of thing. And so be sure to do that. Don't write the way that you talk or text. Proofread. You can also have someone else proofread your paper, which I highly recommend, because so often we read a paper a certain way and we proofread it and we think we know what we're seeing here. But in reality, we don't see it the same way as somebody else does. And so it's really helpful to proofread and have somebody else proofread for us. Unless it's English comp class, it's usually okay to have somebody proofread and edit for us, that kind of thing. You can help us with the grammar. In fact, a lot of colleges have tutoring services and those kind of things that will help with that. Use them. Avoid first and second person in almost every case. Now, if the assignment instructions dictate it, fine. If the professor, for example, the assignment is to write a personal journal about your experiences in whatever, growing up or something, then you might write in first person. In fact, don't write, the author of this paper is age whatever and grew up doing whatever. Don't write like that. That's awkward and improper. You would write, growing up, I experienced this, that kind of thing. But otherwise, if you're writing a topical paper, a research paper, excuse me, almost any kind of academic paper, don't write it in first or second person. I'll show you some examples of how to do that. Follow the APA manual or your organizational guidelines. Sometimes universities will have a little different ones, or whoever you're writing for bias-free language. Again, there's some variation there and some disagreement about which is the correct term to use for this or that, and it changes. It'll change. You look at any edition of the APA, and no sooner than it's published, the social norm for some term is different for race or whatever it is. So those change. Kind of keep up with those, but use your manual as a guide at least for avoiding bias-free language. Pay attention, to how you write things and how you say things. A lot of times how we think comes out in how we write. And then using sources. Be sure that you use sources and use them well. As a student, you know nothing. That's what I was told as a master's student. As a master's degree, one of our professors said, you don't know anything. Well, gee, thanks. But what he was saying is, you're not an expert on a topic. You're a student, you're learning, you're getting information from sources, from professional sources, people who do know things, and then you're using that to build your paper upon. And it depends on what kind of paper you're writing. If you're writing a topical type paper, you may take all the things that have been done and said and research and whatnot on a topic by the professionals, pull them together and make some point. But make sure your point comes from not just your thoughts or your opinions, but that they're founded on something. They're founded on information, on truth, on what we know. Gather information, learn to synthesize the information in your mind. Again, you know what you're talking about, then summarize and synthesize. And you'll hear me say summarize and synthesize quite a bit. You take that information and you know what you're talking about. You've read those articles, you've read those professional journals, whatever it is that you're looking at, that are, again, good sources. And you know your stuff by reading them. You've maybe started writing a paper and sketched it out or whatnot, but then you're going to take that and you know your stuff so you can summarize it and synthesize it, building your thoughts, your beliefs, whatever it is, upon the truth that we learn from the professionals, okay? Again, remember that most academic papers are not opinion papers. You might find, for example, in a discussion board or even in a paper assignment, research this particular topic in the library, what's been done on it, and again, give your opinion of how this might work. Well, even when it says that, it doesn't mean just your whimsical opinion. An academic paper is give your opinion based on what we know in the literature, in the professional literature. So again, use that as a foundation. It's like building a house. You put the foundation down first so that you can then build the walls and the roof and that kind of thing. And then remember, always, always, always cite your information where it's used and include the complete reference on the reference page. In discussion boards and those kind of things, the reference would go at the bottom of your post. But I see this error so often. A discussion board, for example, a student will put a reference at the bottom, but they didn't cite anything in the text, in their writing. So it's the same thing as not using it. If they did use it, they're plagiarizing because they did not cite to show this information came from this source. This thing I wrote here was based on this other person's thoughts. So citations go in text. References is the full information that goes at the bottom or on the reference page. So be sure to cite and include the reference. So what are acceptable sources? Well, first of all, not Wikipedia. Okay, Wikipedia is fine for ideas, that kind of thing, but do not use it in your papers. It's not a professional source. It's user supplied information anyway. But some others you may not think of that I see a lot of times, for example, Simply Psychology. Well, it's about psychology, and it's usually, most of it's in there written from professionals. But again, it's not a professional source in the sense that it's written to professionals. It's a general audience website that gives some information. Now, here's how you might use those, though. Look at those sites to get ideas about what you want to explore further in your topic. You might even use some of the sources that are cited there to go pull yourself. Again, don't just cite them from there. Go pull those sources. Oh, here's 4 articles that they cited here on this particular topic. I'm gonna go look at those and add to my others that I've already pulled. So they're useful for those kind of reasons, but they're not a professional source. Don't use and cite them in your academic papers. Normally not field magazines. Now, occasionally some professors may let you use these depending on the level of the class and the type of paper and those kind of things. But if you're ever wondering, ask. And those are field magazines or professional magazines that are by professionals to professionals, but they're basically opinion papers, and they may have some research in them that they use. Normally, they're usually really well written topical papers, like similar to what you would write, but they are just that. So they're informational. Just know what you're using on that. So what are professional academic sources? The top one, the most important one, the best one, if you will, I hate to use that term, but generally speaking, the best ones are peer-reviewed journals, and especially those that are reporting original research conducted by the authors of the article. And if you're doing a literature review or background to a study for an actual research project you're doing, or for your capstone project, or if you're helping a professor with the research project, they're going to actually do the research, conduct research, then you pretty much exclusively, if not exclusively, use peer-reviewed journals that report original research. Okay, so look there first and primarily use those. In most cases, books written by experts, professionals and whatnot, on a particular topic are also good in professional sources if they're generally written in an academic manner. Now, a self-help book, for example, written to the general public by a psychologist or a psychiatrist or whoever, isn't necessarily a professional source. In fact, usually won't be. So be aware of what type of book it is and what it's used for. Dissertations, at least in most cases, are acceptable and usable as professional sources. In most cases, they have original research. And then on some university websites, for example, you'll have research articles that may not have been published yet, or may not be published, or they're based on something they're doing in-house, that kind of thing. Some of those are good. So again, just pay attention to what you're using, though. And of course, be sure and cite those correctly. When these are used, a lot of times I'll see students will just cite the title of the article or the heading on the website. If it has an author, and you have to look maybe at the bottom of that page or wherever it is, use the author that wrote the article. It's there. If not, use the organization as the author. Don't just put a URL web link, because that's not a complete reference. But anyway, those are sometimes acceptable, again, depending on what they are. One way to kind of keep this in mind as a guide, if you will, is if you didn't go to the library or go to the online library, as normally your university has, for your sources are probably not professional. So in other words, if you just Googled for something, they're probably not professional sources. There are some things on the internet, on the Google or whatever search engine you use, that will find some professional and acceptable articles, some original research, but most are not. And it's sometimes hard, particularly for a student, to tell what is and what isn't, and what's acceptable. Google Scholar is used a lot. And Google Scholar does have primarily good professional sources, but if you've ever used it, I have students sometimes that'll email me and say, Professor Guy, I got this article I found on Google Scholar, but I had to pay $30 to use it. And so this paper cost me, I found 4 of them and it cost me $120. I'm like, all 4 of those are in the library, right? All you got to do, if you do use Google Scholar, is go over to the library, search for that article, and there it is. Okay, so remember that. Google Scholar has some good stuff, but you have to be able to, if you don't have some subscription, is to go look in your library for them. And again, you will find some online articles that are valid, particularly some open source research articles. Sometimes open source, again, they're usually peer-reviewed and vetted and those kind of things, but available to the general public instead of through a paid document service or database. Because you may not realize it, your university library, your university pays a ton of money to have the databases they do in the library for you to search. And by a ton of money, I mean a big ton of money. And so, there's a trend sometimes to have publicly free available information available on the internet or wherever it might be. So there are a lot of those open source type places that you can certainly use. But again, know what you're using. Okay, how do you write then a paper? You've got all these sources and you've figured out the grammar and you've formatted your paper in APA, at least initially. How do you write well? There are different opinions about that, and yes, one English teacher, they say this and another that, but there are some standard rules of grammar and those kind of things you want to follow. But from a thought process of writing, this is what I want to emphasize here. Think this: what do we know and what do we want to know next? And this is especially true in a research paper. If you're writing a research article, a research paper, and you're going to conduct research, for example, you're designing a research proposal. So the first part of your paper is going to be a literature review. It's oftentimes called background to the study or background, or the different journals will call it different things, but it's a review of the research that's been done on your topic already. That's what we already know. Sometimes students will say, well, in their capstone paper, for example, I want to study depression. Okay, well, that's pretty broad. What about depression? Well, I want to study depression in college students. Okay, well, still broad. What do you want to study more specifically? Well, I want to know if a lot of college students are depressed. Well, the answer is we already know that. There are tons of research that show a connection between prevalence of depression in college students and those kind of things. Find those articles, find those the research that's been done, but then you want to ask, okay, we know that. We know there's a correlation between, or a common for students to be depressed. Why? What elements? What demographics? What are specific variables we can look at? Here's what we know. Now, what do we want to know next? So you funnel the information that we know into what we want to know next. If you're writing a topical paper, which is the type that you write a lot of times for most of your topical type classes, content type classes, then you want to condense and get to a point. You're not necessarily making a point. You're not trying to prove something. A lot of times you might be, but in most of the time you're reporting what we know about that topic. What do we know about depression in college students? And you lay all that out, condense it, summarize it, synthesize it, and then make some conclusions. So you do want to get to some point. So even though you're not making a hypothesis or research questions to research, even in a topical paper, you're going somewhere. So make sure you're heading somewhere, you're getting to some point, and you conclude with, again, that funnel. And remember, in writing, always remember to summarize and synthesize. I say that a lot to students. Summarize and synthesize. And we'll talk even more about what that is. So again, the idea of the funnel is that you review the research conducted on a topic, summarize it into your literature review or your topical paper, and to do that well, you synthesize it. Synthesize it means to bring together. You combine it or integrate it. Do not write a literature review or a paper that's just a string of summaries. A lot of times I'll get a paper and paragraph 1 is a summary of article 1. Paragraph 2 is a summary of the next article. Paragraph 3, summary of the next article. And it's just a string of summaries. That's not a well-written paper. It's just a summary, a list of summaries, okay? So be sure and summarize and synthesize. And here's the funnel. Again, kind of visualize it. Here's what we know, and that funnels down to here's what we want to know next, or here's what we conclude from what we've learned, what we've seen in the research. All right? In summarizing and synthesizing, as you write, use quotes sparingly. And you notice I've highlighted that. Sparingly. A well-written paper should not be a string of quotes. Now, here's some examples. I want to show you how this looks. Notice this first quote here, a way that you can rewrite it. The result of, and this would be, of course, a pretend sentence directly from an research article. The research of our study indicated that 70% identified the sky as blue, and so on and so forth. And so you quoted that, which is correct. You put it in quotation marks. You cited it, so it's cited. It has quotation marks around it. Your reader knows you didn't write that sentence. That came from the source. You cited it correctly. You put it in quotations. However, nobody wants to read a bunch of quotes. They want to read your paper. How did you use this information to summarize it? So notice how this sentence is reworded in a summary. It's summarized. Doe 2020, again it's cited, found that most people identify the sky as being blue. However, 30% of their participants identified it as something other than blue. If the whole purpose of your paper, or the point you're trying to make, or what you got from your research you've done is that most people think the sky is blue, then that's all you really need to say, isn't it? And so that's what you said here. You said that most people, based on this research, believe the sky is blue. And then you give a little more information. 30% think it's something other than blue. So again, you reworded that quote in a way that makes more sense and a little clearer reading. Again, summarize and synthesize. Okay, now watch this one. We're going to take 3 quotes on this topic and see how we're going to use those. Okay, so if you in your paper wrote these 3 quotes, and you cited them correctly, and you put quotation marks and all that, you haven't plagiarized or anything like that. You've done that correctly, but your writing is not summarized and synthesized. It's just a string of quotes. Not a good way to write, not easy to read, and doesn't really pull together the information to show that you know what you're talking about and for your reader to get a good sense of that. Okay, so notice the 3 quotes, and I won't read all through them, but leave them up there a minute for you can see them. The results of our study, that's the first one, the one that I used a while ago. The second one, in our study, 82% chose blue as a sky color. And then the third one, Johnson, and these are just different ways to do your citations and your wording. Johnson, 2015, stated, and again, then you give the quote. Participants completed the study, chose blue as a primary color at the rate of 10-to-1. So what we see in all 3 of these is that the majority of people chose blue as a sky color, right? That's what we're getting out of these, all 3 of these, is that the majority of people chose blue or identified the sky as being blue. And you know, when you look at the sky, it might look white or have clouds in it or look yellow or different things to different people. The sunset might look different. But again, you know, this is just a hypothetical, obviously. So what do we do with this? These string of quotes that tell us something. How do we synthesize them? Well, watch what we did here. We took 3, you know, not lengthy, but fairly lengthy quotes, lots of words, and we put it into one summarized and synthesized sentence. It said one thing, right? Research has shown the majority of people identify blue as the primary color of the sky. You see? Very simple. That's all you wanted to say. So why report 3 different quotes saying the same thing when you can put it all into one sentence like that? Again, summarize and synthesize. Here's another example. If we want to add a little bit more information from something we've gotten from our research, we found that majority of people do identify it as blue. However, people who are highly intelligent seem to see the different variations. Again, this is hypothetical, but watch how we would summarize and synthesize this. Most research reviewed indicates people generally identify the sky as blue in color. That's the sentence we just used a while ago. However, Einstein and Da Vinci, 1652, which would be a too old a source to really be using, found that, unless you're talking about historical documents, found that people with very high intelligence tend to identify more specific and varying shades of color in the sky. Now, if this was in your paper, this is a well-written summary and synthesis. It tells your reader a summary of what the different research shows, and you're looking at 4 different sources here. 4 different sources that you pulled together and said something in 2 simple sentences. Okay, and so that's why, you know, personally, when students ask me, how long does my paper have to be? I prefer to say as long as it needs to be. And the reason is because it needs to be as long as it needs to be, right? It needs to be able to present the information that you need to share in a way that's helpful to people. So let's talk about what we call a crash course in proper citations. One of the things that you see all the time, very frequently, are students who plagiarize. They may have been lazy, they may have done it on accident, but they're still not properly citing and giving credit to sources. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. Here's just sort of a chart to kind of summarize, and you can stop the video if you want and look at this more directly. But if you buy a paper off the internet or copy it, there's a lot of things we call cheat sites. I'm not even going to tell you which ones they are, but I can find them. So don't turn in a paper that you got off a site. You can, you know, search for a particular assignment that's common in a course, and you'll find it on the internet somewhere in one of these cheat sites, and you can get part of it off the cheat site for free. Then they want you to pay for the rest of it. And some students will do that. They'll just pay for it, put their name on it, turn it in. That's very much cheating and plagiarism. If you hire someone to write your paper, same thing. Most cases, depending on the class and the professor, you can have somebody proofread, maybe even edit in some cases. Most dissertations, for example, might have an editor that someone mark the grammar, mark different things, and then you fix them. You know, they just mark them, that kind of thing. English comp, you probably shouldn't do that. You're supposed to be writing your own paper, or even editing your own paper. Again, it depends on the class. But hiring someone to write your paper obviously is plagiarism. And then presenting a thought or idea as your own when you know that came from somewhere else. Maybe you got it out of a textbook. Maybe you got it out of some articles you pulled in the on the library, or the internet. But you put it in the paper as though you thought of that. That comes from you. Obviously, deliberate plagiarism. Sorry. Probable plagiarism, a lot of P's there, is when you fail to cite a source, even if it's accidental. Now, you notice the footnote there at the bottom. Some schools in their academic dishonesty code will define plagiarism as intentionally not citing information or not crediting the source. Others will say if it is intentional, then it's plagiarism. If it's not, then it's just an accident. Well, one, you don't really know if it's intentional or not. If you're a student, what are you going to say? Well, I didn't mean to. I thought I did it, or I didn't know I had to cite that, since it was for whatever excuse you can come up with. So generally the standard is, if you don't cite it, the idea is you should have known. You were supposed to know as a student, even in high school. I know some people didn't learn it very well. You're supposed to know how to cite information. You're supposed to know you're supposed to cite information. So be sure you do that. Sharing a paper or parts of a paper or ideas with another student, for example, is generally plagiarism. You didn't come up with that idea or that part of the paper. You just got it from your friend or somebody that took the class last year, and you stole that piece of it or that idea and turned it in for your own. Again, plagiarism. You're probably thinking, well, I just got some ideas from them. Well, there's a fine line, and you can do that. But there's a fine line between getting an idea from someone as far as helping how to start your paper, for example, and then actually borrowing people's content. So make sure you know the difference there. Then, of course, if possible plagiarism, sometimes when you paraphrase something, students will say, well, I rephrased it, but it's so close to the original, it's really just changing a few words. That's not a paraphrase. Again, a paraphrase says you knew what that sentence said and you put it in your own words, literally. If it's only changing a word or two, then you quote it. But again, the preference is to not to plagiarize, to paraphrase. Hiring someone to proofread your paper usually is okay, but again, it might depend on the course or the professor. Always good to ask about that. Developing someone else's ideas without giving them credit. Again, sometimes there's a fine line depending on what you're sharing, but if you're not sure, cite it. That way you stay out of trouble. And you're giving credit. The really plagiarism is stealing. So you're giving credit to the source of whoever came up with that idea or did that research. Plagiarism quoting, even if you put quotation marks around it without identifying the source, is generally plagiarism. It's certainly inaccurate, incorrect. You might have said, okay, somebody quoted this, but who? So you got to cite your information. Presenting assignment that was cut and pasted from a source, even if you cite it, but didn't indicate it was quoted. There's a couple of problems with that. I see this happen a lot of times in discussion boards. A student will go to Wikipedia or Simply Psychology, and they'll find a discussion that fits the discussion that they're writing about. They'll copy that paragraph, paste it right into the discussion board, and then at the bottom they might put simplypsychology.com or whatever it is, Wikipedia. So they might usually don't even put the correct reference. They just put the link, or they might even put the reference. But they didn't write any of that discussion board. And you see the problem with that? You're supposed to be taking information that you learn from the sources and using that to write a discussion board or to write your paper. And instead, you took what somebody else wrote, pasted it in your paper or your discussion board and said, here's my discussion board. Okay, so that's plagiarism. It's also not your work. What are we grading? We're grading what somebody else wrote, what the person on Wikipedia or Simply Psychology wrote, not what you wrote. Okay, so and of course, if you put quotes around it and cite it correctly and put the cited reference, technically that's not plagiarism, but you still didn't write the paper or the discussion board, so it still has a problem there. But you see how that works. So hopefully that helps to understand. Use sources, but you write the paper. How to cite sources. I think this will be helpful here, so pay good attention to this. A lot of times we'll see this in errors or struggles with this in papers and discussion boards. Keep in mind the difference between a citation and a reference. Citations are in text. When you're writing some of those examples we gave a while ago, you cite the information in your sentence, where you used it, again, sticking a reference at the bottom or in a reference page does not show that you used it or where or how. You must cite the information in the text. References are what you include on the reference page. They're the complete reference, and there's an example of one of those. So in the text, as you write your paper, you would use Smith 2020 or Smith and Johnson 2020, cited in text. In the reference page, that's where you'd put that complete information down at the bottom there. And you'll notice something that I see the students do a lot. In citations, you don't put the initials, but in the references, you do, the first initial. So you'll just kind of notice the difference there. Say it's not a big deal, but it is, details again. Credit any and all sources. If you're not sure, cite the thing. You use the source, you got some information from it, cite it. This is corny, but some idea I come up with years ago. When in doubt, cite it out. Okay, if you just keep that in your head. When in doubt, cite it out. Should I quote cite this? Is this common knowledge or not? I'm not sure. Well, just cite it. And that way you stay out of trouble. And be sure you give credit to who you should give credit to. Again, can't emphasize enough, use quotes sparingly. Do not make your paper a string of quotes. And of course, as always, summarize and synthesize. So I want to go through this. You can stop the video as you go through here if you want to look at this more closely. But this is just another example of how you interpret information from a source and use it. Make sure that what you cite, what you reference, what you write that came from the source is accurate. So just real quickly, let's go through this. This came from this source. This is actually a quote. It should be in quotes, except I'm just showing it to you here. So this is the actual quote from this source. In terms of the overall impact, parental depression, if you stop and read this closely, pause the video, you'll see the parents are the ones that are depressed. Keep that in mind. The emotional and behavioral problems are the youth. The youth are the ones with emotional and behavioral problems, but only the preschool and adolescent groups of the youth. So if you kind of keep those three things in mind, that's what this is saying, then it helps you as you try to cite this. So watch how this might be used here. Parental depression usually appears with children who have emotional and behavioral problems. What's wrong with that revision? Why is that not an accurate representation of what was said? Well, one, it's not cited. It doesn't cite, there's no citation there. It doesn't say that you got that from anywhere. If you put it in your paper like that, you'd be plagiarizing. However, you'd be plagiarizing incorrectly because it's also not an accurate presentation of what the thing said in the first place. It said that, what this says, is the way it's written, says that all age groups of youth have the problems, and that's not what the original source said. It limited it to preschool and adolescents. So see, make sure you accurately represent whatever is being said. Sometimes I see students do this because they want to prove a point rather than report what is, and so they'll kind of skew information, and sometimes it's hard to find and sometimes not. You'll go back and look at the source and say, I knew that didn't sound right, and sure enough it didn't. So now this is not the best worded sentence, but notice that at least it's accurate to what the original said. And you can go back to the original if you want to look at it again. Parental depression, again, who was depressed? The parents. Parental depression usually appears with preschool and adolescent children who have, again, the children are the ones who have that, emotional and behavioral problems. So it tells you who had the depression, the parents, and the population there that it's associated with. So again, maybe not the best worded sentence, but you kind of see how that works. It's at least accurate, it's cited, and the reference would be on the reference page that you see there. So remember, summarize and synthesize. Don't forget that. Test question. Which of the following is true? You can plagiarize your own work, or you cannot plagiarize your own work since you were the one that wrote it. If you wrote a paper, for example, last year in a class on, we'll say, depression, and this year you have another class who said turn in a paper on, write a paper on depression, and you turn in that other paper, is that plagiarizing? Well, the answer is yes. You can plagiarize your own work in either way. You can use something that you've written before, just like you use somebody else's source, but you got to cite it. You cite yourself. That's how you do that. But also, if you're turning in a paper that was presented in another class, or even a previous in that class, you didn't write the paper for that class, but you're submitting the paper as though you did. Here's the paper that I wrote for this class on depression. Well, no, and you not say that, but that's what it's the message that you send by turning it in for that assignment. No, you wrote that paper for a previous class. And by the way, we use some software and different things that can pick that up sometimes. Sometimes you might get away with it. But the point is, you shouldn't do it, okay? So be sure not to turn in, there are occasions where a professor may allow you to do that, okay? You cannot turn in an assignment from one class or even a publication without permission. Sometimes a professor might allow that. You cannot use material from another paper, again, depending on how it's written, what it is, but you cite that. If you wrote about something previously, you cite that paper previously that you wrote, okay? This is mostly done and most important in published papers, in research articles, where somebody might have researched a topic their whole life. And so they're referring to some research they did back in something that was published 5 years ago. Well, they don't just stick it in the new journal article they're writing. They reference that, guy 2015 found this in the research, blah, blah, blah. You do it that way. So again, citing yourself, that's how you do it. All right. And you can always ask. You can ask the professor, hey, I wrote a paper on depression last year on this class. Is it all right if I turn it in for this assignment? It fits. And some of them will say yes, but you have to ask and get permission. Okay. So when in doubt, what? Cite it out. If you're not sure, cite it, ask your professor, whatever it is, make sure that you're not violating the academic dishonesty rules. Cite any and every source where used. These are just sort of some summary things. Cite any and every source where you use it. Again, you can write it in a way that doesn't just a string of citations either. For example, Smith found so-and-so. They also noted that, and then you're writing in a way that's good, easy to read and not having to cite in every sentence, but your reader knows that that information came from that source. Your citations must match your reference list and vice versa. I see this all the time too. A student will have some citations in their paper and they might have those in the reference, but they may also have 2 other sources that they didn't cite in their paper. If you don't cite something in your paper, even if you looked at it and read it and kind of got some ideas, if you didn't use it to write your paper, if you did, you should cite it. If you didn't, don't include it in your reference list. So your reference list and your citations must match, okay? And again, you don't have to cite every sentence, but write so that it's clear to your reader who said what or who provided what, okay? So watch this. Again, these are just some examples of how you might rewrite something in a smoother, easier to read way, summarizing and synthesizing. Instead of Smith 2014 included in the research such and such. Smith also found blah, 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 blah. Integrated research theory was associated with blah, blah, blah. You might write it this way. Smith 2014 included in the research such and such. He went on to note that such and such. Furthermore, it was found that such and such. See, I don't have to put the citation all the time, which makes the reading a little bit awkward. And actually, here you wouldn't put the date in the same paragraphs, but that's another issue there. But what about this one? Here's another way to do it that is even better, more summarized and synthesized, if you will. And we'll say Smith as a female in this case. Smith, 2014, in her research on integrated counseling theory, found that such and such were common practices among counselors. So I took the 3 or 4 ideas that I wanted to present up in the top there, and I summarized it and synthesized it into, and this was from the same source, but into a better written paper, a better written sentence or 2 sentences. So again, pay attention to that and see how to do that. How to use sources. Use your manual to correctly format the references. In APA 7th edition, your references, again, that's what goes in your reference page, are found on chapter 10. You will find an example of almost any kind of reference you could possibly think of to use there. So use that manual The outside is a good alternative too if you've ever used that, but the manual is the official thing. Just as a suggestion, I paperclip the, and actually I have the wrong page there. It should be 313. There's two reference pages. One is the about referencing, and then chapter 10, which is 313, is the actual samples of references. So you might even paperclip both of those, but put a paperclip on the citation chapter, one or both of the reference chapters, the heading format page, which is page 48 of your 7th edition, and the sample paper on page 50, because you'll see exactly what a paper is supposed to look like and see a lot of details in there. So I recommend that you go ahead and do that. Put paper clips there. And if you use the tab version, even if you use the spiral tabbed version, you may still want to put paper clips at the top of those. Your reference list must match citations. Citations match reference list. Again, I've said that a couple of times. I'll make sure that you get that, a common mistake. And be sure your references are correctly formatted. Pay attention to the details. A lot of times I'll see references in the reference page, but the capitalization is incorrect, or the italics, or they may do it one way in one source and different in another source. It's not even consistent. So use your manual and do those correctly. And for example, the way that you capitalize a book may be different than the way you capitalize a journal title versus an article title. And so again, look at your reference, make sure you get those right. So hopefully that this information is helpful to you as you strive to be a good student, but a good communicator in your academic career, whatever long that might last, other areas of life. And if you don't take away anything else from this, make sure that you keep in mind that you're writing something to somebody else for somebody else to read. How is that person going to perceive what you presented? Is the information you presented well communicated? Will they understand what you're saying? Will they want to read your paper? Is it gonna, are they gonna get tired of reading that bad grammar? Are they gonna get tired of trying to figure out what's plagiarized and what's not? Are they gonna read this paper and say, this student knows what they're talking about, I can see it in their paper, I get their point, they use good grammar, this student is a smart, intelligent, straight A student? Again, you may not be one, but how you present your information is received by the receiver in a certain way. What does that say to the other person?